Lebanon's protests reap rewards. Demonstrators forced the Prime Minister to resign. But will the rest of his government be forced out too? I'm Imran Gata, and today's newsmaker is Saad Hariri stepping down. On the streets of Lebanon, they're not calling it a protest, but a revolution, as Saad Hariri called it quits, saying he'd hit a dead end. There were celebrations, but it's unlikely to end the impasse. Demonstrators want a complete overhaul of the political system, believing it's the only way to save their country. Over the last few years, Lebanon has been teetering on the edge of an economic meltdown. Now the central bank warns it's just days away from total economic collapse. So who's to blame for the nation's problems? The protesters say it's all down to a corrupt ruling elite that have filled their own pockets while the rest are struggling to get by. They want change, a new government, not one based on religious and sectarian lines, rather one made up of independent experts that can revive the economy, end corruption, and unite the country. So is it possible? Well, let's ask our guests. In Washington is Basem Shabb. He's a former MP with Saad Hariri's future movement Bloc. And in Beirut is Gilbert Doumit. He's one of the founders of the Lebanese opposition party LiBaladi and ran in the 2018 parliamentary elections. Gentlemen, good to have you both on the program. So Basem Shabb, Hariri has stepped down. He's not fully out of office yet. Some technicalities to get there, including the president accepting the resignation. But has he made the right decision?
Let me first say that for the first time in a long time, I'm proud to be Lebanese. And let me say that my family was part of the demonstrations. The demonstrations in Lebanon represent a new spirit, and they go beyond politics. And I think that is very evident. And I think it's a source of pride for the Lebanese that under these conditions, they showed harmony. They showed unity across sects, across social strata, from working people to university professors. This is a new movement, and I think Saad Hariri did the right thing by resigning. That is a most definite thing, that he did the right thing.
Gilbert, are you happy that the Prime Minister said, enough is enough, I'm going to listen to the protesters and step down?
Definitely, this was our first demand. Do I think it's a right decision? I don't think he had an alternative. First, because of the protest on the streets, but also second, and what he said, he couldn't forge an agreement with other political parties. After what happened, after the 17th of October revolution, I think most parties are dismantled internally, and the level of tension that is between them makes it an obligatory move. So I wouldn't give him credit for this. I would say it was about time to resign so that we prepare for a good transition and rebuild our nation based on new premises and principles.
Gilbert, any chance that this is tactical and that perhaps he has a bigger plan up his sleeve?
Does anyone have any illusion that the current political elite will leave just because there are protests on the streets and people are claiming it's a revolution? They're going to wake up in the morning and say we're leaving? No. We know that even if there isn't a bigger plan, historically, every time the country united around any form of demands, they united all together across all spectrum against us. This happened in the last elections, in the municipal elections, in different movements that happened the last 10 years. So we have no illusion that they will not come together again to protect their positions in power.
Right.
But I think that's the first time ever we've been dreaming of this moment of uniting. Everyone's on the streets having the same demands against sectarian clientelism, but also demanding political, economic, and social rights.
Okay, so Basem Shabb, power doesn't just roll over and die and say, okay, you won. we're looking at it quite cynically, I guess. You're saying you're very proud to be Lebanese, but we're asking questions, which is our job to do. Do you accept that given Lebanon's political history, people have good cause to be cautious about their leadership saying, okay, we want to implement change right now?
I think what happened really divided the political leadership in Lebanon. There are those who clearly supported the movement in the streets and this new revolution. There are those who were neutral. And I must say that many of the people on the streets, and Gilbert knows that, were supporters of Prime Minister Hariri. And there are those whom I think are the biggest losers who stood against this movement. They assumed it was limited. They assumed it will go nowhere. And in the words of Hassan Nasrallah said, the government will not fall. We will not allow it to fall. So when the dust settles, there will be winners. There will be losers. And when elections come next time, people will remember who really supported this movement and who was against it.
Gilbert?
And there's no doubt that the youth in Lebanon,
Right. Let's ask Gilbert. Gilbert, is it time for Hezbollah and Amal to get with the program and fully support what's happened on the streets? Because, as was mentioned by Basem, they've been equivocal at best and at worst downright hostile towards the protests.
I would like to start just to diagnose the problem. So the problem is not only the Prime Minister and Saad Hariri. So we're talking about a political system that everyone abused. The 6 leaders and the 6 sectarian parties have been abusing and protecting for so long to maintain their economic interests, but also their control over power. So it's not only, and if you listen to the movement demands, it's not only an issue of the cabinet. So the demands go as far as we want new elections to change the parliament and the Speaker of the House and eventually a new president. So this means, so people are conscious of the root causes of the problem. Should Hezbollah and Amal join? They shouldn't join. I think everyone who led us into our crisis should be held accountable. And I hear often, especially international media, okay, let's look at you and look, so you're demanding things that are a bit too far. If I look at any country in the world, whenever you fail in governing your country, you resign and there are early elections and you go for a new government. Why Lebanon is not allowed to do this? And it has always been played by fear. And if I look at Basem, because I know Basem, we used to be together during March 14th. For example, like Lebanon has lost someone like him in politics who's decent and who's competent. So this is what we're calling for. We want people who are decent and competent, who are not affiliated to any party, to make sure that we rebuild our nation and implement our constitution that is a secular one.
So Basem, when people talk about needing technocrats and experts, are they basically saying decent, competent people? I mean, Gilbert considers you one of them. Decent, competent people who won't wreck the economy and screw this up like everybody else has done over the past few years?
What Gilbert says is true, that the thing that really prompted this movement was an unmitigated disaster in economy, in finance. And it is all because of political bickering. So Gilbert is right about that, and you cannot get people who got us into this mess to get us out of it. But I think a lot of the wise political leadership know that their time has come and gone. And it's time for new faces who are patriotic, clean, who want to do something and make a difference. And we should give them a chance. I think to go back to the old ways would be suicide. Already Lebanon is beyond recovery anytime soon. So we need to change course very quickly, very quickly.
Right. Gilbert, we've had the Iranian Supreme Leader warn the protesters, you can only make changes within the existing system. You can't overthrow a system. It's not like his country had a revolution or anything that brought him to power. But he's already waded in, right? And the reality of Lebanon is that it's a small country caught in the crosshairs of many powerful nations, whether it's the Iranians, the Saudis, and others. Do you worry that now is the time for the rest of those nations to start to play their cards, whether the Saudis or the Iranians? Do you worry that they're going to start to fiddle now?
I do worry. And if I look at historically, because we're very open, we're very fragile for this power sharing system, this sectarian power sharing system, we've been very fragile to international interferences. And we've never succeeded in having a foreign policy that would protect Lebanon from geopolitics. Yes, definitely we are at a high risk today. And I think we need to be very careful on how this transition is going to happen, to try and work hard in not allowing geopolitics and geopolitical interests into getting involved. There are some good signs so far that no one has interest in some form of violence in Lebanon. And I don't think any of the current parties have any interest or capacity to do this. Even Hezbollah, when we say they have arms, have capacity to get involved in any type of violence in the country. And I think we should bet on this. And the faster we move in the transition process, the higher probability of success in achieving our political outcome would be. I hope, and I think we're giving them a gift by staying on the streets and keep the pressure so that we finish this phase as soon as possible, to limit the fragility, the possibility of using our fragility for other interests. I hope they will take it as an opportunity and not put us into trouble again.
Basem, how does Lebanon right now help insulate and protect itself from becoming yet again another proxy playground and battleground of other powers? Because usually when there's an opening, they come in for the kill.
I think there were attempts to characterize this movement as being funded by some agencies or countries, but even Hassan Nasrallah himself admitted this was a spontaneous thing. And what we saw could not have been orchestrated. Demonstrations in all of Lebanon, all of towns, across religions, across sects. I think people misjudge those who think in terms of realpolitik and countries intervening, thought this would go nowhere. And they were mistaken. There's a new spirit. And this spirit is not going to go away anytime soon. And I think the countries around will have to adapt to this new reality.
Okay.
I think it's very difficult to make use of it. They will have to adapt to it.
Gilbert, what's on the menu? What would it take in the forthcoming months for people to go off the streets? Is it, I don't know, fixing the electricity crisis? What is it? What would give them trust in the institutions?
Okay, so I think the core term is trust. What the country needs now for the economy and our financial crisis to turn the cycle positively, Lebanese need to trust government, and the international community needs to trust government again. Because if you look at the last year, so we haven't got any step forward with SADR funding because of the no trust in government. I think this is the opportunity now, is to have a government that Lebanese trust and the international community trust. And this is why we're insisting on the issue of people who are experts, but it's not enough. People who are independent means do not take their decisions from their political leaders, from the Zaim. Otherwise, they're not able to make any progress. So this is why that's the second one. And there is a third condition that's very important, though it's technical, is the parliament giving this cabinet legislative prerogatives. So it doesn't have to go back to the parliament for three things. One, an early elections based on a law, an electoral law that is non-sectarian, but also that would change the power balance within the sectarian divide. The second thing is take immediate measures on economic, social, and financial measures, because the country is in really deep trouble. And the third thing is make sure that we have an independent judiciary so that we can really seriously start efficiently in accountability and fighting corruption and holding accountable whoever has been involved in corruption. Is it an easy process? No. I think the only tool we have today are the streets. And I agree with Basem. People who are on the streets will never leave. And they don't need anyone to manipulate them. Well, we have 35% unemployment rate.
Yeah.
No electricity. The waste is on the streets. Let's not forget that 2 weeks ago, our forests were burning and we didn't have any means to extend the fires. We are in deep trouble. No one needs to mobilize us on the streets because we have nothing to lose anymore.
Understood. Gilbert and Basem, it's been fascinating talking to both of you. Looking forward to having you back on the program. But for now, let me thank you. It's been great having you on the Newsmakers. Bye-bye. Well, 2 weeks of anti-government protests may have forced out Saad Hariri, but 13,000 kilometers away in Chile, President Piñera is standing firm against demonstrators. 1 million people were on the streets of Santiago as the country faces its biggest political crisis in 30 years. It all started after the government announced a 4-cent raise in train fares. While it may not sound significant, for half the population that lives on $500 a month, it really is. Chile is one of the richest nations in Latin America, but it's also one of the most unequal. Chileans want to level the playing field and are demanding their billionaire president step down. He's made changes to his cabinet and announced sweeping reforms. But is it enough to save his job? Haider Abbasi reports.
Chile's capital is on fire, and the government is struggling to contain it. Protests have spread across the country. In a few days, they've evolved into riots. Thousands of people have been detained, and the government of President Sebastián Piñera has deployed the military. It's the first time soldiers have been seen on the streets since the dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet ended in 1990. 10 cities had been put under a state of emergency and a curfew. Since lifted, demonstrators remain defiant.
The struggle is now in all of Latin America against these systems that are really so unequal that they oppress the most underprivileged.
Protests began against a rise in train fares in Santiago. But the reasons for the demonstrations quickly expanded to include inequality, low wages, and the high cost of living. Chile has the strongest economy in Latin America and has been the most stable nation on the continent. But its wealth isn't trickling down. According to the World Bank, Chile is the most economically unequal nation among the world's 36 wealthiest countries. A government survey shows the richest 20% of the population earns nearly 10 times more than the poorest 20%. Chile's billionaire president recognizes the problems go back years.
It's true that the problems haven't come about in the last few days. They've been building up for decades, and the different governments were not and are not able to recognize the situation in its total magnitude. This situation of inequity and abuse has led to a genuine and sincere movement on behalf of millions and millions of Chileans. I recognize and demand forgiveness for the lack of vision.
But Piñera hasn't been sympathetic to the protesters. He previously has said his government is at war with what he called a very powerful enemy. The president's hostility and the deployment of soldiers seems only to have antagonized the demonstrators. Human rights groups have accused the military of using excessive force. Piñera has since announced a package of reforms, which include raising the minimum wage and increasing the basic pension. But will this be enough to satisfy the protesters and help to defuse the crisis? Haider Abbasi, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now in Santiago is veteran Chilean politician Sergio Bitar. Most recently, he was the Minister of Public Works under former President Michelle Bachelet, but he's been politically active for decades. He was detained after the coup in 1973 and exiled before returning in the 80s to actively oppose the dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet. Sir, pleasure having you on The Newsmakers. Tell me why it doesn't seem as if Piñera's proposed reforms and sacking the cabinet has been enough for those people who are out on the streets.
It's not enough because it's a movement of size that we haven't seen in our history. All of us, we are very surprised with the magnitude of the social mobilization. And parallel to that, a magnitude of looting and anarchist violence attacking the subways and other infrastructures that we have not seen in our history either. So it's hard to analyze and understand how the country that has the best economy in Latin America has a strong democracy with parties compared to other Latin American countries explodes in this way. So my feeling is that's a long-term process towards an economic and social system much more devoted to solidarity and equality. That will take time, and people will not stop. So we will have a long process. That's my understanding. Now, in the short term, you have to take and make strong decisions. Some of them have been taken. And we hope, as opposition, I belong to the opposition, that we can strengthen our democracy to start a new constitution, to build a new social pact, and the government will understand that. It's not clear that they will do.
The point that he was making was that this is the fault of successive governments. So while he did admit that there is too much inequality and there is a lot of wealth that is not going around, he's also blamed previous governments when you guys were in charge as well, Michelle Bachelet and so on. Is he right? Has this been something that's been a long time coming and every government has failed?
Yeah, the feelings of inequality have a long history. They have started many years ago. So the center-left parties that were leading the country for 24 out of the 30 years after the dictatorship made lots of changes in economic reforms, tax reforms, education, health, housing, justice, human rights. But it was always in some way obstructed by the conservative parties that saw these reforms as against their own interests. So there are, you have to self-criticize what you have done, but there are different responsibilities in this process. So are these social movements enough to shake the political parties? I think that yes. Are the opposition parties in conditions to take the new elections, win the new elections and govern? Not yet. They are divided. So we are living a period of an important change at this moment. But I am confident that we can stop violence and at the same time to move towards more participation, more dialogue that we don't have enough, and to strengthen our system for the future.
So thousands detained, hundreds injured, at least a dozen people dead. Some estimates have it as over 20. It's not absolutely clear. And the UN wants to look into it and investigate. But when we look at the UN High Commissioner of Human Rights, it's the former leader, Michelle Bachelet, on the other side of the political aisle here. Is that going to be helpful or harmful if Ms. Bachelet comes forward and says, hey, you're committing grievous, terrible crimes as the government? Is that going to cause more trouble within Chile?
I would say that for most of the Chileans, human rights is a critical element in our culture, and we have to protect that strongly. So the presence of former President Bachelet and sending this group, and the government also positively saying all groups of human rights that wants to come and see are welcome. So that's very important. We have in the country an Institute for Human Rights that is an independent institute whose leader is a member of the opposition, and they are controlling everything. So the point is that we have to, and that's very hard, to bring back calm and order so that even the most modest people can go to work, can enter the subway, can buy food, because anarchist groups have been looting. And so this part of the picture, I think there is a big agreement that you have to control that in order to have order to push for social change. And human rights are critical. So every part of the country is supporting the presence of people from the United Nations and sent by President Bachelet.
Right. And interesting times ahead, because there's going to be a big summit in December, COP25, the UN Climate Change Conference taking place in Santiago. It's going to be interesting to see whether the streets will be quiet by then and what reforms have been made. Sergio Bitar, it's been a pleasure speaking to you here on The Newsmakers. I thank you very much for joining us. I'm looking forward to talking to you again.
What's making an impact online? What has people sharing and discussing and debating all the stories from around the web?
Newsfeed, every day on TRT World. This November on TRT World, The Newsmakers takes the political